The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of Acuma, its board of directors, its management staff, or its members. The podcast discussion presented is conversational in nature and for general information only.
This is Acuma's On Point Podcast. On today's episode, we'll get an update on the road to housing. We'll talk about the CFPB and maybe hint at a possible shutdown in late January. But before we get to our episode, just a quick word from our sponsor.
This episode is being brought to you by Loan Vision. Is your credit union looking to turn your accounting department into a profit driver? Loan Vision can help. Our platform delivers real-time data, loan-level insights, and automations to streamline workflows and improve control over financial performance. Transform your cost centers into revenue generators by equipping your team with the tools needed to better serve your members. And don't miss our monthly webinar series, where we share key strategies and best practices to help credit unions optimize their mortgage operations. Register today at www.loanvision.com under our upcoming events page.
Hello, welcome to Acuma's On Point Podcast, a series focused on sharing the stories of people who are making a positive impact in the credit union mortgage industry. I'm your host, Peter Benjamin. Today, I am joined by our resident expert, our first-timer, Joel Herberman, policy analyst with Brownstein. Joel, how are you doing? Welcome to the pod for the first time. And what's going on?
Doing well, Peter. Thanks so much for having me on. Really excited to join the pod.
I love it. Love it. Now, this is, what's the saying, long-time listener, first-time caller.
Exactly.
Excited to have you here. For those that don't know, Joel is really, the brains behind a lot of our Washington and policy insights. So it's really good to have him on to kind of give you the latest update as we wrap up the year. All right, Joel. So let's kind of go down that list that we talked about, but pre-recording, pre-podcast. Several topics I think a lot of our listeners are really interested in. So first up, one of my favorite topics, let's start with road. So what's going on with the road to housing?
Yeah, so that is really kind of the big thing in housing policy right now. I think, as noted in some of the prior podcast episodes, the Road to Housing Act was attached to the fiscal year 2026 defense bill, which is one of those policy pieces that pretty much every single year it moves. I think this is on pace to be the 65th straight year. And so the Senate had it in there. The House version did not. Over the last couple of weeks, there was a conference process to kind of decide what will make it in the end. And unfortunately, the Road to Housing Act ended up falling out. One of the main sources of opposition was in the House Financial Services Committee, they really had not yet put together their housing package. They really wanted to have some input into the process. The government shutdown in October really kind of slowed down the House Financial Services kind of effort on housing. They were supposed to have a hearing and then a markup in October and kind of have everything ready. Those plans were delayed. They had to push back to December. And so just in a couple of days from the recording of this podcast, they are planning to mark up a bill called the Housing for the 21st Century Act. And so looking through both that bill and the Road to Housing Act, there are roughly 10 provisions that are the same. So they have both House and Senate buy-in. And there are also some that are, of course, different. The Road to Housing Act has, some provisions on appraisers, a points and fees provision that would allow the CFPB to, kind of encourage a little bit more small dollar lending. The House bill takes a little bit of a different approach, using kind of a pilot program that could be put in place. And so, the House bill hasn't been marked up yet, but we'll kind of see in this last week in session how that goes. It's expected to receive broad bipartisan support since it has buy-in from both Chairman Hill and Ranking Member Waters. And so heading into the new year, the package could be considered on the floor if it makes it out of the committee. And ultimately, for something to get signed into law, there's going to be there needs to be bicameral coordination between the House and Senate on a lot of these housing pieces, as well as a vehicle for it to ride on. There's a chance that it could go standalone, but things ride typically a lot easier if it's attached to a spending bill or something like the defense bill.
All right. So, question. So you obviously have the House bill, which was dropped on Thursday. Hill and Waters are behind it. Now, do you see at any point in time that when you have these two bills, road, and I think you said housing in the 21st century, do you just see like the end product just being married up, the two kind of being combined when it's all said and done, and that's what ends up going through? Or are they going to be two independent bills that kind of have to fight it out for supremacy?
Yeah, so I think it's really going to be a mix of the two. The House rejected the Senate's bill. The Senate isn't going to take the House's bill. I mean, it's a very good sign to see that there are some provisions that overlap between the two. You would think that those would have a good chance of getting through, some of which are a provision to kind of alter the permitting process for small housing projects, increasing FHA loan limits, and making some changes to the definitions of manufactured housing to include modular and prefab.
Mm-hmm.
So those pieces and some more, that's a great starting point for, a kind of compromise package that'll need to be hashed out. But yeah, there are some pieces like HUD's home program. Both bills take kind of a separate approach, which will need to be reconciled. And there are some provisions that will definitely need to be hashed out before, something is agreed upon in both chambers.
Now, do you, using your crystal ball, I mean, obviously, here we are. I mean, this is, the House bill at this point in time is, by the time we get to it, by the time this podcast is released, it's only going to be about 2 weeks old. But did the House bill include, and keep in mind, I haven't looked at it yet, but has it include, the small dollar amount lending and kind of clarifications around that? Because, that was one thing that I was particularly watching, because was the small dollar amount was being established at $200,000. And the reason I was really looking at that is because I think credit unions can really fill that void in that small dollar amount lending, whereas others might be hesitant to do it. Oftentimes when you pay, a loan officer based off of their commissions based off dollar amount, that $200,000 loan is really just going to get ignored. Right. They're going to go out for that $500,000, $600,000 and kind of just push that $200,000 loan amount off to the side. And so, getting that portion of road through, and even if it's part of, the housing in the 21st century, that right there is a niche that I personally see credit unions really mastering and capturing, and people coming to credit unions more than any other lender. So I know I kind of just rambled a bit, so I apologize, but was that small dollar amount loan or limit included in that House bill?
Yeah, so unfortunately it was not included. There was an additional small dollar mortgage provision that would have that would establish like a pilot program on ways that, there could be direct loans to borrowers for FHA loans, as well as some support for closing costs, which is title insurance. And just thinking that like both the House bill and the Senate bill have that bipartisan buy-in, that bipartisan support. I wouldn't think that any bill or any provision that's not included in one couldn't eventually end up in the final package. This will really need to be hashed out between the leadership in both the Senate Banking Committee and House Financial Services Committees. And, I don't think anything's really off the table, even if one provision wasn't included in the other bill.
Yeah, that's good to know. Because if you're going to talk, and this is just me talking, but if lawmakers, policymakers, if they're going to truly talk about redefining manufactured housing to include modular and what it actually means to originate those types of loans, and if that's part of the focus, you really have to include that small dollar amount provision in there as well, because they really they're almost one and the same, in my opinion. Now, you could argue on the opposite side that they're totally different, but if we really are going to solve the affordability crisis in this country, giving lenders, not just credit unions, but lenders in general, the ability to originate a loan at $200,000 and not have to have so much concern or about high costs. That's extremely important, right? For us to kind of move this needle forward on expanding homeownership. Anyways, I'll come off my soapbox. Let's kind of move on to another one of my favorite topics. I'm so happy you proposed this. What's going on with the CFPB?
Yeah, it's a very common question these days. There have been so many different twists and turns throughout this year. And so just most recently, one thing that we're watching just kind of on the leadership side of things, the administration nominated a senior OMB official who has a background in natural resources and energy policy named Stuart Levenbach to serve as the CFPB director in around mid-November, which caught kind of everyone by surprise. This happened as the acting CFPB director, Russ Vought, his term is set to expire. Like he wouldn't be able to serve unless someone else was nominated. It's part of the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. And so the CFPB pretty much confirmed that this nomination was just put in place to ensure that acting director Vought can continue to stay on. And I believe that's until about May or June of 2026 that this kind of procedural move will allow him to continue on. And so, now that kind of leadership question is addressed, there is still the very big question over the CFPB's funding. Of course, the agency is continuing to rely on a DOJ legal opinion that argues that any funds it receives outside of Federal Reserve profits or combined earnings are just generally unlawful. And so in a recent CFPB court filing, they said that they expect to remain in operation through the new year. But just over the last couple of weeks, the Federal Reserve has recently returned to profitability, which could sort of complicate or maybe undermine some of the Bureau's arguments that it won't be able to operate, that they will have to kind of take some of these funds. And so, the courts right now are really the place to watch, to kind of learn what the future of the Bureau is going to end up being. There really haven't been too many developments in the last couple of weeks, but of course, the CFPB has a pretty big agenda that was released just a few months ago. And so this kind of legal question overhang is really kind of at the heart of what's going on, and really, looking at the court docket, seeing what happens is really kind of the key right now.
This one's interesting because it's out of all the topics we commonly talk about, right? This one, I don't want to say it reads like a soap opera, but it has that much drama behind it, right? And it's so far reaching that you almost have to kind of take a step back and question, and not so much in a bad way, but you have to question, okay, well, what's really going to happen next? Because we've talked about in the past with with you in conversation, but not so much on this recording, but you in conversation. We talked about it with AM, we talked about it with Zach, we talked about it with Leah. You can strip down the CFPB all you want, right? And you can get to a point where you have a director over a two-person, bureau. But at any point in time, especially under a new administration, this animal could come back, tenfold and really change things up, in a different way. So it's really just fascinating to watch how they're almost stripping the CFPB down to really represent almost nothing, but it's still like the 200, the 2,000-pound gorilla that you're just trying to cage. That's all you're trying to do, right? I think that's probably the best analogy. You can cage it, but eventually, it's gonna get loose, I guess. I don't know. So very fascinating on CFPB. Just really just fascinating. And I like how so just a question on the person who they have nominated for director of the CFPB, this person from OMB. Is this just another one of those ploys to kind of keep Vought in control, and eventually this person's gonna withdraw, and we're gonna go through this process again, and just we're almost like kicking the Vought can down the road, just keeping him in control?
Yeah, so I believe under the Federal Vacancy Reform Act, not 100% certain on this, but I think there can only be 2 nominee withdrawals to keep in acting.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so the first one, of course, was Jonathan McKernan, who was nominated back in May 2025. And then now the second one is Levenbach. Of course, the Senate banking has no intentions of holding a nomination hearing for that nomination. And so I think if the Bureau is still funded and has stuff going on in kind of late spring 2026, early summer, there could be a potential new nominee, but that is very far in the future for right now.
Very far. All right. I almost feel silly asking about this one because I feel like we just went through this process and talking about it a lot. But here we are. January 30th is right around the corner. What is going on with a potential government shutdown, the likelihood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, give us an update on any possible shutdown that could happen in January.
Yeah, so since the continuing resolution that ended the longest shutdown in U.S. history, which took place in November, there really has not been much or any progress on fiscal year 26 appropriations in Congress. There have been kind of talks in the Senate of getting kind of a package of 5 of the 12 required appropriations bills to get through. As of now, it's really been all talk. Nothing has really happened. The House and Senate also remain very far apart on their kind of top line spending numbers. And so just looking at the calendar, we're pretty much done with 2025. In January, the House and Senate will only both be in session when both chambers are there for 2 weeks. And then the House will be in, and then the Senate will just be in. And so there are very few kind of legislative days ahead before this January 30th deadline. And so we are probably looking at another continuing resolution. And honestly, probably a lot of the same sort of dynamics will be at play between the potential shutdown coming up and also the one that happened from September 30th all the way to mid-November. And just one caveat that's a little bit different, that might be a little bit different this time, along with the continuing resolution that passed in November, 3 of the 12 fiscal year 26 appropriations bills also were signed into law. And so those cover like the agriculture department, Veterans Affairs, and a few others. And so that accounts for roughly 10 to 11% of federal funding. And so that would remain in place if there is a shutdown, as well as SNAP would be fully funded. So, that was a big issue during the shutdown in October, November. That would be off the table if there were to be a shutdown in February.
Interesting. All right. So I think that does bring up a good, transition to, the final topic, in addition to a potential, early 2026 shutdown. Again, I stress the word potential. What else kind of can you hint at when we look at the year ahead for 2026? Give us some insight as to what we can expect.
Yeah, so things will look a little bit different. There, of course, the midterms are coming up in November 2026. Primaries are going to start to begin in winter and in spring. So kind of political partisan dynamics might change a little bit as, just governing will get tougher with the election coming up. And just also on the calendar for all of October, there's not going to be House or Senate in session. And so it just makes things a little bit tougher. And so just looking through that context, some things we're watching, GSE reform, GSE privatization is, of course, a really, really big topic. The administration was kind of weighing an IPO, Fannie and Freddie, of some small portion of their stock, which didn't happen in 2025, but that is something that certainly could happen next year. And also the House Financial Services Committee is expected to, begin efforts looking at GSE reform in the first quarter of this year. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on. And one other thing I thought I'd mention is AI. Of course, everyone is talking about artificial intelligence right now. Yep. President Trump in early December released an executive order seeking to limit state regulation of AI, arguing that, we need a single framework. We can't deal with 50 different states regulating AI. And so it'll be interesting to see, if it withstands potential legal challenges, if Congress will seek to legislate on this issue to make kind of the executive order permanent. And just conversation about AI in general is really likely to heat up. It was a topic in the 2025 off-year elections on data centers, energy policy, potential restrictions on AI. And I think that's just going to continue to become more and more of an issue as we go forward.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's because, it's most certainly on the minds of a lot of our members, the direction of AI, another fascinating topic. AI really evolves faster than, the politicians can sit down to write the opening paragraph to any potential bill. And, it would be good to get some direction, especially from a lending standpoint as to, how we can approach this. But also, I mean, we I think for the sake of our members, we continue to suggest that they adopt AI as a way to make things more efficient, not replace, but improve efficiency. And so this is a good example of something that is far reaching, impacts a lot of different industries, that, a lot of our members are really keeping, I don't want to say a close eye, but they're definitely paying attention to. Now, as we also, you mentioned, in 2026 midterm elections, I mean, at that point in time, do you feel like we'd get a good sense of the new direction of the House and Senate? Obviously midterm, and obviously we'll have, the towards the end of the year elections, but do you have, at that point in time, do you see any type of change? But also, I guess the second part of that is, by the midterms, we should get a good sense of who the Democratic nominee is for the next presidential election, right? Or who might be considered in the running, right?
Yeah. I think directly kind of after the midterms, the 2028 election will pretty much begin in earnest, regardless of what happens in the midterms. There's also that kind of lame duck window when the 119th Congress will be turning into the 120th Congress, where there could be some bipartisan deal making and the opportunity for things to go through. But I think pretty much directly after the midterms, we will enter the 2028 race, which will be quite a time.
Yeah, that one's gonna be very interesting. I will say that. But anyways, Joel, thank you very much for your time today. Truly do appreciate it. Enjoyed the conversation. As always, appreciate everything that you and the rest of the Brownstein team does for Acuma and our members. So again, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Of course. And to close out, thank you again to Loan Vision for sponsoring today's episode. And to all of you, we know your time is valuable. Thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of Acuma's On Point podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, be well, my friends.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time at the Acuma On Point podcast. If not already, be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. For more great episodes and information, be sure to visit us online at acuma.org. And to get the latest updates, head over to our LinkedIn page.